Welcome, Modestus. Kishore, nice to see you always. Welcome back. So thank you for joining today's session. As you all know, Quant University has been hosting these lunch and learn sessions for the past few months with all the changes happening in the generative AI space. So we have had multiple eminent speakers come down and talk about the various things which are happening in the agentic AI space. But also on the regulatory front, we're seeing SR 26.2 replace SR 11.7. So there's been a lot of discussions on how this is going to change the practice of model risk management. Will model risk management take additional hats in terms of understanding the generative AI space and bringing up new frameworks and standing up new infrastructure for validation of Gen AI products? Now that we know that 26.2 has explicitly made it the onus of responsibility for practitioners and companies to think about managing the risks associated with generative AI products, and they haven't provided a prescriptive approach on what needs to be done for agentic AI, generative AI products. So with that effort, we have been hosting a bunch of sessions. I am also in the learning mode, so I don't claim to be an expert on all the fronts. As you know, this is a multi-pronged, multifaceted approach we got to take because it's not just the technology. It's understanding how do we apply these recommendations in the workplace, but also the field is changing. Technology is constantly evolving. We have our frameworks within our organizations. We have our policies and procedures. So we got to make sure that we adapt those to the needs of what we can do. Now that there isn't a specific regulatory mandate, doesn't mean that we have a free pass to do whatever we can, because we still own the fiduciary responsibility. We own the risk of using these products. So we got to think holistically on what makes sense. And that effort in working with Premier, we have put together a course, and there was a lot of discussion on what needs to be discussed in this course. And we have been discussing with various practitioners from various companies. And I thought I'll share some of the things we are kind of packaging it as these are some of the things we need to think about. And I wanted to create a masterclass. That way you are all familiar and we can invoke the discussion. I know a lot of experts are in the room, so I would love to kind of see what your thoughts are. In addition, we hosted a roundtable last month, and we had 12 different EVP level model risk practitioners in the room. And we had a fascinating discussion on what needs to be done in the context of generative AI. It was a candid discussion because, well, in some ways we have the unknown unknowns. We don't know everything, but we are expected to be responsible to provide guidance within our own firms. But there's also a technology gap. Most of the aspects of generative AI are not something which we can easily read and kind of just digest within an organization. So I would really appreciate you to kind of be involved in the discussion and share the best practices you're having with your own firms. Because in some ways, it's something we should be considering as something we should always be openly discussing within our circles, because we have a very small community of model risk practitioners. If you kind of talk to each other, you probably know, 1 or 2 degrees of separation, someone you already know who has been working in this space. And the forums, the meetings, we more or less see each other on a regular basis, and we have to put together a collective effort to see what best practices we can evolve. So let's kind of get started, and I'm going to take the next 20 to 30 minutes on what my thought process is based on the discussions we have been having in the field, and I'll open it up for Q&A. That way we can have a discussion on what makes sense. Let me see if I can bring up my screen. Okay. So one of the thoughts for this particular session is I want to kind of just primarily focus on generative AI and agentic AI related aspects in ways of how we have been seeing model risk management evolve as a profession and what needs to change when we think about large language models. I have a dual background. I kind of, started out as an engineer. So I bring in the systems engineering practice, the process engineering practice. That way we can, kind of establish workflows, which is becoming kind of the state of how most of the generative AI products are being adopted in practice. Whenever we talk about a particular workflow or a use case, we talk about a pipeline, we talk about a process. So in terms, we are kind of engineering workflows because there are multiple touch points, coming in from data from multiple places, interacting with APIs, potentially having an MCP call, potentially going and leveraging a particular tool. So we are kind of building out these engineered practices. My other side of the background is computer science, which wherein I built distributed systems and talked about like the various aspects of how systems could be built. So I appreciate the practice of, formal specification, the formal engineering practice of how software products are built, from taking into a specification, putting together the requirements document, putting together the whole notion of how this has to be kind of going through a phased approach of building out the products and how we can govern and how we can test these products. That way you can kind of establish a process on how you are building out products. Now, most of you are using Claude or some other tool for generating code, and that's becoming the norm of the day, wherein we are using generative AI products to generate code. And it kind of draws the question of, what does validation of code generated by various systems mean? And at that point, you have to start thinking about, are we still in the prompt engineering world, wherein we are just thinking about smart and intelligent prompts? Or are we kind of building out systems that way we can think about these processes as established governed practices so that we can say, this is the code generation pipeline, this is a pipeline for generation of a summary, this is the pipeline for generation of a suspicious activity report. All those use cases will require specific pipelines. So in some ways, model risk managers and are not going to be working in isolation. They need to work with the first line very closely. They need to work with cyber, they need to work with IT. So we are going to be expected to work collaboratively with multiple organizations. It's not just going to be kind of an independent function wherein we do everything on our own. So I'm going to try and draw some of those examples through this session. And ultimately, I want to see, if there is appetite for you all to engage in some way so that we can kind of, build out a practice which is more robust than what we have now. So as we all know, as I mentioned, SR 11.7 has now been superseded with 26.2. I think most people in the room are already familiar with it. But if you are not, you should probably just do a Google search and kind of understand what this does. So this notion of effective challenge, as we talked about, it's now something which we have to think about very, very concretely, because we don't have a prescription of what that means in the context of GenAI. Now, things we already know, right? So which in the scope, we have statistical models, stress testing models, credit risk models, things wherein we have, here's the defined output, this is the expected output, how do we build out the models in the base, and then what is reproducibility, what is validation, things are already in scope, we already know that. Things which are not in scope, which is kind of becoming the norm of the day if you talk to any organization, is the use of generative AI. Things about either calling an LLM for either summarization or for information extraction or for even question answers, marketing models, et cetera, et cetera. So those are becoming things which are common practices in the industry, but this particular document explicitly calls it out of scope. Agentic AI systems, 2026 has been, every time you talk, you listen to any conversation, it's all about agents. And fun fact, my graduate thesis 25 years ago was building multi-agent systems for information access and manufacturing systems. There was no intelligence, there was no large language models. We were defining agents and their capabilities and what they could do and what they could interact with, what data sources. they could potentially access and what was the mode of interaction. At that point, we were using XML for sending messages across multiple agents. Most of the decision making was rule-based and very rudimentary approaches to talk to different agents. And we envisioned a world at that point wherein there are going to be agents wherein we can call and they could potentially access the tools they need. Guess what? 25 years later, it's there. And the only thing we changed in those 25 years is I lost all my hair. In the context of building out agentic systems, it's something near and dear to my heart. So I'm kind of enjoying this whole innovation because now I can pragmatically approach these problems we had been envisioning with actual solutions. And it just takes a few infrastructure related calls and understanding the space so that you can stand up something and see if it actually works. Now, things about prompt engineering is becoming more and more robust in the context of, well, initially it used to be trial and error. Now we have a lot of design best practices on how you could potentially use. We are now also thinking about templatizing it and using recipes, saying that this is the design pattern to invoke a particular way of calling a particular function. We are also looking at ways in which we could do validation. In fact, Agus had two great presentations. If you didn't get a chance to attend it, it's all recorded on qskillbridge.ai. I'll throw out some links at the end. Please do look at it because Agus and I, we have kind of discussed this at length in various forms over years, but now we are having the ability to establish and build out those practices. So you can kind of actually try out many of the things in practice today. And then the notion of understanding the problem space itself, because many a times people think, I just need to do enough engineering to make it work. It's not the case wherein we are going to be using LLMs as something which is always going to give us the results we want, and we can basically reproduce it all the time. The non-determinism is by nature. So you either need to engineer systems so that you factor the non-determinism as a part of a design, rather than thinking of it as let's build out enough engineering to eliminate that non-determinism. So you got to understand that this is by nature, the way of the design, the models, the way it works, and you got to make sure that you factor that as a part of your design. Now, just because it is out of scope doesn't mean that we can just eliminate it from practice, because we have risk management and governance practices and we own the risk, right? So we basically have the governance design given back to us, and we have to basically establish practices. And that's where the confusion is, because what do you do for a fintech? What do you do for an insurance company? What do you do for a small bank? What do you do for a large bank? Every company has its own policies and procedures which are already established, different roles and responsibilities. And now we have to factor like who owns the generative AI risk. IT could potentially take a project to for budgeting, saying, we need these tools so that we can bring in these tools into the pipeline and do these particular things. Model risk has to also be involved in the discussion to figure out, how do we gate these processes and when do we say that this is ready for production? First of all, is model risk the right organization to make those calls? And do we have the right kinds of talents and skills to even do those kinds of calls? And in that case, I've seen a lot of companies establish these AI councils, wherein you have this interdisciplinary group of people from multiple disciplines coming together and then kind of chiming in. But again, that doesn't really establish a framework. It provides a forum wherein you can build some amount of consensus on where the direction should be, but you got to establish action. You got to see how you can establish this practice. And that's where we are going in terms of establishing practices, knowing what we know, rather than thinking of it as just a thought exercise on what could be done. Okay, so I'm going to try and start expanding on some of the things which we already know. So we have the things which we got to understand. What is materiality in the context of Gen AI? Ongoing monitoring, because it's not a one and done deal. When you build models, there are going to be things which are specific to the Gen AI space that needs to be thought about. And this notion of effective challenge. Now, what is our role as an independent second line review mean, and how do you kind of think about it? Right? Okay, so we all know our responsibilities, right? So we were clearly told that the first line is going to be building. They are going to be owning the business outcome. They are going to be moving things and ready to ship. And then we come in as second line and evaluation, governance, validation evidence, reproducibility, what is the defense, and then we were always providing, the effective challenge mechanism for the first line. But now those lines are kind of graying, because just imagine a second line person who has never built a retrieval augmented generation system. And if you've never built something, how are you even going to think about validating it? Because the development is a part of understanding what goes into building a system and what level of comfort you're going to have. Where are the things which could potentially go wrong? What are the metrics we need to evaluate? So all those are things which needs to be brought about in the discussion. So some of the design aspects, that's where I think education is important. I mean, most organizations are upskilling. I mean, I've had multiple calls with people wherein people have been talking about like, well, we need to upskill our analysts because this is not something they have read. They're picking up from LinkedIn, they're picking up from a Udemy course, but it's not contextual. And most conferences are also talking about these as though this has been in practice forever, but you got to think about like, I got to establish a baseline on understanding what are the traditional models, what are generative models by nature, how are they built. So now we have to start thinking about what does validation mean in the context of a generative AI model when you compare that with a traditional model, right? So let's keep it simplistic for this particular discussion. I mean, in the consulting work we do and in the discussions we have with companies, there's a lot of context involved, and then we typically hone into areas which are of interest and we go deep. But for the purpose of this discussion, I think a couple of things which needs to be understood. One is this notion of non-determinism, right? So you are not kind of expecting an answer to be accurate and deterministic. You are basically sampling. That's where whenever you put in a prompt in ChatGPT or your favorite tool, you ask the same question again, you don't get back the same answers. Like, well, there was the same question, why didn't I get back the same answer? Unless you engineer it to a specific degree to say, okay, this is what your choices are, give me one of these choices, and then you get back the same choice based on the query you have posed, right? The second aspect is correct is a judgment. You don't have ground truth for everything, because most of the data which has gone into the model is something which has been sourced from the internet, billions and billions of data points. Some of it could potentially be already there because it was trained at a particular snapshot in time, or you're enabling web search that it's going online and searching for the results. And sometimes you have to think about like, well, I'm going to ground it by providing a retrieval augmented generation system or additional context along with the query, and you try to see that this is what needs to be done. But again, it's all engineering, right? So you got to understand that you don't have something wherein you could say, here's my training data, here's my testing data. If it works on this, it's going to be good enough. And then we talked about the prompt sensitivity. And this is something which is extremely important because we all grew up building software programs in the programming world. And our goal was to understand the subset and what the language constructs are. And we said, well, this is the number of keywords in the programming language. We're going to combine all those things and then start building out specific constructs and then encapsulate them into functions, further encapsulate them into object-oriented programming, have these abstractions and say that this is how our program works and build deterministic ways of execution of these programs. But it's not the case when we are thinking about prompting. Prompting is basically an instruction to a language model saying that you need to do certain things, right? And the way we express it is we express it in natural language, in English or your favorite language, right? So when we do that, even small words without sufficient context will potentially change the outcome you're going to get. So what does that mean if you are creating interfaces to end users wherein they are going to be providing prompts? Think of a chatbot, right? A customer service chatbot like Erica on Bank of America, if you will. So if an account holder comes in and puts in information, what is the expected answer? How are you going to even test? What are the permutations and combinations of prompts you're going to be putting in order to do the test? And then the opaque reasoning, right? So we don't have a nice regression equation with weights sitting behind the scenes saying that this particular coefficient is providing this much of weight, and that's the reason why we are seeing these results. We have opaque reasoning, so we have to think about how these models are actually generating the results, but we can't really rationalize to say this is the reason why you are getting back these particular kinds of results, right? So here is where we have to think about, in the olden days, we were kind of gravitating towards training data, weights, and then either it's vendor control or we're getting it from a particular data source or we have it internally, and that's kind of frozen. But now we are looking at the validation surface, kind of have the prompts, what kind of context it is using, and the outputs, right? So these are the things which needs to be inspectable, versionable, and testable, because that's how you are going to be generating your evidence. Because the evidence is not something wherein you can say, hey, I've tested a bunch of prompts and it all works, right? And now the question is, what are the retrieval logs? What are the prompts which were used? What were the outputs? What are the metrics? So all those kind of, you're basically building out what are called as validation pipelines to figure out like how these products are kind of working. Now, a lot of failure modes. I've kind of focused on 4 in here. And this is another field which is constantly evolving. And as you know, Claude had the Mythos discussion a few weeks back. We don't know everything about it yet. Some of the large institutions have gotten access to Mythos, but there's always the technology front, which is constantly evolving. And what that means that we are going to see new kinds of adversarial attacks and new kinds of failure modes. But the ones which we are commonly seeing are things like hallucination, right? So which is basically, you getting back an answer which looks very confident, fluent, and it could be just factually wrong. And there have been so many instances wherein you just look at the tone of the way the response comes and say, okay, well, that's a confident answer. But when you start digging in, you're going to see like, oh, there are a lot of things which the answer misses out, kind of thing. The second one is prompt injection. And this is something which is becoming extremely important from a corporate front, because now, because you're using English or any other natural language to provide your requests, there are methodologies wherein you could potentially make the guardrails disappear through specific kinds of prompts, which means that in a static setting, if you have stood up guardrails saying that, hey, this is where I'm going to be protecting myself because these are going to help me kind of avoid certain kinds of malicious prompts, there are ways in which you could potentially do prompt injection attacks. And that's something you got to think about, like, and again, it all depends on how material your application is. If it's something simple, we have seen instances. I know there was a recent example wherein on Amazon's Rufus, which is a chatbot on Amazon, you could potentially put in about solve this partial differential equation and also give me, the colors of this particular rug or whatever it is. Then Amazon would answer both the questions. It would solve your partial differential equation, even though it was not designed to solve partial differential equations. And that's because, you are able to kind of manipulate your LLM request to kind of, ask additional questions and get back answers. But just think about, privacy related concerns there, or potentially exposing things which you should not be if you're kind of trying to do that. And then this big challenge of non-reproducibility. Developers may say, hey, I've done the testing, everything works great. You do the same test, you get different results. How are you going to validate whether the tests were sufficient? How are you going to make sure that the tests are things which you in additional testing you got to do? And then this notion of explainability, because what are you going to be explaining? How are you going to be justifying the output you are seeing? Are you explaining the output? Are you explaining the process? So there's this whole discussion on what does explainability mean in the context of LLMs, and that needs to be thought about. And again, I don't want to take too much time trying to give you everything, but just to kind of give you a feel for some of these failure modes. So you have to kind of think about every question you are going to be asking in the context of financial applications. You want to be able to ground it, and there are various ways in which you can ground it. One is commonly used retrieval augmented generation, which is where you are basically saying, answer this question for me, but use this information I'm providing and only use that information to answer the question. which tries to, let the LLM know that you should not be hallucinating if you don't know the answer. So which is, and again, an engineering process, because how do you create the RAG in the first place? And how do you make sure that you have all the context information? There is a chunking methodology you got to think about. What is it 500 characters? Is it adaptive? Is it dynamic? Are you going to be, adding more information? How do you do deduplication? All those are, technology-related aspects you have to think about. And then also, how do you test it? Sometimes you may have to build out tests to say, use information which is not there in the RAG, because I know that only these parts of information was provided to the RAG. Now I'm going to ask questions which is not in the RAG. So what will the context look like? And what will the answer look like? And you may have to say explicitly, it's like, if I don't know the answer, or if the context is not sufficient, reply back, I don't know. Does it even work? So all those tests that needs to be done. And then the faithfulness aspects of it, and things like citations. If you want to kind of say that according to this particular policy, your claim is rejected, or as per this particular internal guideline, we do not want this particular clause to be there in a particular document if you are kind of generating certain documents. So you need to be able to enforce citations, and you don't want to make sure, once it's generated, you don't want to kind of start searching whether the citations were there at all. On the other hand, prompt injection is extremely difficult to test, at least on the MRM front, because now you are kind of wearing multiple hats. You're kind of, removing your formal, let's do an effective challenge, to kind of, getting a baseball cap and being like a hacker. You're thinking like a hacker. You are doing red teaming exercises. You are thinking about, I'm not trusting this machine anymore, and I'm going to be providing it with different kinds of prompts. In fact, last year, there was a red teaming exercise at the Dana-Farber Research Center, and me being a faculty member at Northeastern University, I was invited to take part of it. There were 42 diverse hackers slash practitioners who were trying to do a lot of bashing for this LLM, the internal LLM Dana-Farber Cancer Research was hosting. We also wrote a joint paper associated with that. So there, the challenges were extremely hard, because we don't know what the doctors are, the different analysts who are going to be using that platform for. So you have to make up different kinds of prompts, and it's impossible to cover the whole gamut. So which means you have to think about different patterns on what kinds of outputs are going to be generated, whether PII is going to be leaked out. How do we make sure that we test for those particular cases? And again, it's all use case specific. You cannot, in generality, create an entire gamut of use cases and say, let's apply the same set of use cases for all my applications. There's a lot of domain expertise required. You had to think about materiality. You had to think about what are the data sources and where things could potentially go wrong. If a query comes in, can I address the query and ensure that the query itself is malicious and we should not even send it to the large language model? Should we think about the LLM having guardrails to ensure that you are not answering certain kinds of questions? Even if certain information was processed and you got back the results, how do you put in additional layers to ensure that you're not sending things which you should not be? So all those are important questions you got to answer. Then this notion of reproducibility. And this is extremely hard for me. In the context of LLMs, sometimes you may have to rerun the same query multiple times. And most of the times I create harnesses. I don't do it manually. I create different kinds of harnesses to say, okay, what does outputs agree mean? Many times you may have to think about, if there are two, what do you call, natural text outputs coming out, you may have to calculate the embedding and then calculate the distances between these, and then say, hey, are these similar? Are they completely different? And what kinds of thresholds? It's all use case specific, but you got to really understand the possibilities when you're kind of generating these systems. And many a times I even question whether, as an organization which is not very closely working with the first line, can you even independently do it? Many times you may have to sit next to the first line and kind of design these harnesses so that it's inbuilt as a part of the development process itself, so that you know what the expectations were when you start validating those processes. And then the explainability and the audit trail. So many a times, we treat prompt as code. And that's something extremely important because prompting is not something which should reside in a cell or in somewhere hidden in the code, which is not something traceable. Prompts need to be completely independent of the actual code. In fact, I'll actually share some of the things we do in the applications, I develop and we have designed. So this is a platform we are developing for our own internal purposes of content creation. So we have something called as a prompt hub. So the prompt hub is basically like these are all the prompts which are actually created and engineered by me and my team with a lot of vetting and everything. But anytime the prompt is not going to be static, it keeps changing depending on what we see. So for example, if I'm creating a course for Northeastern University, let's say I have my own prompt on how I need my prompts to be created. So I have my prompt, but I also have a change log. So I basically can see anytime I made a change, what kinds of things were there, and I basically can track all of them. I can do a diff of one prompt versus the other. So I basically treat prompt as code. And that's the best practice you got to think about, like as you're building out your systems, that prompt is basically code for an LLM. So you got to version it. You got to make sure that it's there. And then same thing with context. Like, where is the context coming from? How are you kind of, building out the context? How is it attached to your prompts? And what is the expected results? And thus, now that we have models which have thinking and reasoning built into it, like how do you capture those traces? Now, if you have used Claude or any other tool, my favorite part is not the output. I keep clicking to see what is Claude doing as the thought process. And many a times I detect like, oh, it's not even seeing that. I exactly gave the information I thought I should be giving as a part of the attachment, and it's not even seeing it. It's kind of, going in a particular direction. So I need to sometimes like add more context to say, hey, no, don't go there. I want you to think in this particular direction. And here's an example on how to think. That way I redirect the LLM to think in a particular direction. So those traces are extremely important, both in the context of development and also in the context of validation, because many times those traces provide the rationale for how the reasoning is happening behind the scenes. And then finally, thinking about citations, can I attribute a particular statement or an output to a source which I had internally? That way I can justify why the answer came into being in a particular place. The framework which we use as we kind of build out, and this is primarily something which we are actually creating like a workshop, 2-day workshop for getting organizations started on building out a framework for AI governance. And many a times we basically use this 4-pillar framework to kind of build out. Think of it as like an MVP for a startup, right? Most of the times you don't generate you don't basically create an entire company and say, okay, what do we do? You always start small, you build out the various pillars, you debate, you iterate, and you kind of scale it and see what works, and you kind of enhance it as you see what works, kind of a thing. So we basically take it into 4 pillars. One is the foundations, which is like, you don't need to start with agents. Many a times agents are not required. So you start with the foundations. Can I build prompts? Can I use a context resource? It could be a retrieval augmented generation. It could be actual documents you attach to a particular prompt. So you start with the foundations. And then you think about agents, because now you're thinking about like, React design pattern or another design pattern wherein I would say, I want you to go take this problem and go to MATLAB and then generate some code for me and execute that, solve this problem and get back these results. And I'm going to assimilate that in my report. And then I may have to do it loops, because you may have to try multiple times, maybe web search. Web search, I'm going to say, generate 3 queries to search for information about comps for a particular company. And these 3 queries may be completely different, because I want to be able to try different queries so that the search results are different, and I can consolidate those search results, and I can then rank it and then use those search results to feed my next part of the pipeline. So I may have to build out price. So I may have to try 2 or 3 different things and then maybe stop at that point if I say I don't find the results I'm expecting. So I'm going to stop in here. versus kind of do other things. And then the evaluation and the red teaming, that's the important part, which is where you got to build out a framework for what needs to be done in a particular place. And then finally, the governance piece on how do we kind of validate it, because all these four are things which I would be expecting in a validation report, because you want to be able to like justify why you went out in a particular way. Now, as I mentioned before, like, the prompt as a code, we have a whole framework to kind of think about prompting as coding, because ultimately you are now generating code in using prompts, but this needs to be versioned. This needs to have a trail. You need to have tested this particular prompt. You want to be able to verify this and say this prompt actually works. It cannot be the whims and fancies of a developer to just write in something and then say, okay, this is going into production because this is what happens. I mean, when I look at certain prompts, many times it is so simplistic. Create two different patterns, and it would be just a single line. So what is the context? How is it going to be, using particular data sets? What are the guardrails? Nothing would be there in the prompt. So you have to think about even aspects of meta prompting in order to kind of build this out. And then sometimes the evaluation metrics, you may have to build it on your own. I mean, I understand the technical evaluation metrics which are out there. Many times people say, you know what, I read this paper, I like this metric, and I'm going to use it. But many times you have to start defining your own quality metrics. You own the risk, right? So you have to start defining like, well, here are the kinds of things from a quality gating perspective I'm going to weigh based on the use case. And I have to think about like various aspects on what is faithfulness, being able to reproduce what I was expecting. What is completeness? Is it giving me the complete results? Consistency, am I able to like get the results properly? Hallucination rate. So here you would kind of build it out. And many a times the weights are the ones which needs to be calibrated, because when we do testing, you cannot have humans do all the kinds of tests. You will have to build LLM-based test harnesses, if you will, to scale the amount of testing. Generate 500 different prompts so that I can test this particular use case. And those 500 different prompts, you got to be able to say, okay, here are the kinds of things which I want to inject in the prompt so that I can test these kinds of different things, right? But again, how do we calibrate the various test use cases? And that's where a human in the loop would come in. A human would potentially weigh different things and provide those as samples. And these are the kinds of things these are good prompts, these are not so good prompts. Or maybe if the LLM comes back with an output, the humans would be rating it. So it's a collaborative effort wherein the human reviewers are going to be establishing the required metrics for particular use cases. Again, I can't claim to say that this is scientific and it would be completely at a conference level, it would beat all the kinds of theoretical frameworks, if you will. Ultimately, there isn't anything wherein I could say like this is science and I can prove this in a particular way. You got to have heuristics, you got to have metrics to ensure that you can build something practical. The challenge is two-front. One is you take something very canned, which may not be even appropriate for use particular use case, but it's theoretically everybody uses it. You see it in different conference papers. You thought you're going to use it, but it's not applicable to your use case. On the other front, you may say, these are the things I know, and I don't trust the additional process, so I'm going to do whatever I can, which is the example I gave. 20 years ago when I was starting to do validation, I would see like 10,000 Monte Carlo simulations. I would say, why 10,000? It's like, well, the server goes down after 10,000, or it won't be ready by 6 o'clock in the morning, and that's why it's 10,000. So many a times those local constraints will dictate how your testing is done. So this is where I think you got to use your collective knowledge on what you already know to build out metrics which make sense for you. And then the notion of LLM as a judge, it's sometimes it's debatable whether that's do we trust a system which itself is not something. We are basically taking an output of an LLM and passing it to another LLM and saying, are you going to verify it? It's not always possible to just throw it and say, okay, are you doing a good job? Sometimes it works. For example, if I write a particular article, and then if I instead of me reviewing it, I open up another thread, pass that article and say, wear the hat of whoever the end user is, read this article and provide feedback. It starts a new thread, it'll give you feedback. You can use that iteratively to clean up your output. But many a times it's a trial and error method. So you may have to kind of think about what actually works. Sometimes it may work, it may not work, but you got to think about ways of calibrating and kind of inducing the human intelligence into the loop so that the LLM kind of knows what is expected of the human. And then obviously the adversarial testing, this is a vast field. I mean, NIST has a paper with multiple kinds of attacks. There's no way you can kind of try out all the possible attacks. It's like cybersecurity, right? So, there is no way you could basically say nothing bad is going to happen. I have the latest antivirus software or other kinds of guardrails. It's always the case wherein it's a cat and mouse kind of a game wherein you think that you have everything covered, but new things are going to keep coming in. So you've got to make sure that you have a framework. You know which are the ones you have to do with respect to privacy leakage or bias testing or things which are regulatory required, but also things which are technically some things you have to do. But then you have to build out a framework which is adaptable towards the novel challenges. And you got to work with the right kinds of people who understand the field so that you can make sure that the use cases can factor the various kinds of things. And then when we talk about an agent, actually, the last few weeks we've been discussing significantly in our prior Quant University discussions, like, when we think about a model, it takes an input, it returns an answer, and now we have to think about the output and what's the risk associated with that, right? But in the context of an agent, the agent is now able to call different tools. It can access multiple systems. It can create different plans and execute upon it. So the risk lies not just in the output, it's in the behavior on what are the kinds of things it's doing to actually generate those particular outputs. And that's where, I kind of, say that you have to think about governing the actions, like what are the possible actions it can potentially do? What are the kinds of tools it can do? What level of permissions? So it's this whole architecture process which needs to be thought about as you're building it out. And the anatomy, I mean, right now, this is the state of the art. Come back 6 months, probably this is going to be dated because there are going to be new technologies and new methodologies of calling different things. I mean, MCP and the specification came out, no one talked about it. Like a lot of people are now using it to do enterprise integration. There are a lot of tool calling being done. But again, this is an evolving field. So we've got to make sure that our control points and our way of thinking also evolves as these products potentially evolve. So I have a couple of different use cases which I typically use in my, both in my discussions with end users who are trying to use it for the first time, but also in some of the classroom discussions we have. I mean, this is just a simple example. Like, I have what is called as an investigatory agent, which is, right, is used for drafting a particular AML alert, if you will, right? But then I have an independent QA reviewer agent, which also does a review of completeness, accuracy, and the policy fit. And then once this agent produces, this agent reviews, and then there's a human gate wherein the decisions will be say, okay, this is what the agent prepared, this is what the review results are. Do you agree that this is okay before I can send this one out? So that's where you have two independent agents kind of have separation of duties, and you can build out the automation to kind of make it work. But then again, in the context of building out, these are all design patterns which are evolving. So you have an agent which calls an MCP server to do a calculation, let's say solve a partial differential equation or whatever it is. But then you have a compliance layer wherein you have logging of all the tool calls which was done, checking of the policies. Am I okay to go into a particular database, extract certain factors? Can I go and call a particular tool? So all those decisions and the logging should all be kind of logged, and that's where you're kind of building out the pipeline. So you're here governing not just the model, so it's not just model risk management. It's like governing the connectors themselves. So here are the potential connectors, and you're kind of governing the actions. So here, the audit trail when we talk about is you have to start thinking about like, what's the lineage? Where did the information start? What all did it seek for making decisions? And how did the results come out? What prompts were used to build out the whole thing? So that's kind of the lineage. And then the controls, like, you have to have established guardrails to say, here are the controls that needs to be done. Here are the various things that needs to be addressed, both when the input comes in, when the model does certain things, and when the outputs come out. What are the metrics I'm going to be using when I do a particular run, and see whether there is drift in certain kinds of metrics, and how do we think about validation? And then the outcome analysis, which is ultimately the truth test, right? Because you may think that I've built out the entire system, it's fantastic, I've done everything in the lab, but when you release it into production, for example, a chatbot, how many times do people actually seek a human? If that is the majority of the calls, the way the chatbot interaction ends, it means that your agent isn't working because they want to talk to a human. And that basically is to say that, it's not completely capturing all the things which you should have thought about as a part of the design. So there are obviously checklists. Obviously, you can't have one checklist for everything, but you got to start thinking about like, well, what do I do if I need to validate for prompt soundness, determinism, non-determinism, explainability, design, fairness, et cetera, et cetera. We are a very rich field in finance because we don't just think about it as a scientific product. We have to think about the people who are going to be impacted by the usage of these tools. You have to think about the risk. You have to think about the fiduciary responsibilities. You have to think about the opportunity and the product engineering because you have competition from other companies and other products. So there are multiple facets which needs to be factored in as we're building out our validation list. And that's something, and again, obviously the regulation aspect of it, it's a regulated industry. You got to make sure that you're complying with all the required regulations. So that is where I think you have to think about it holistically. Now, I've kind of provided a very simplistic gating kind of a decision, but ultimately, many a times we have what is called as a decision paralysis, wherein we think about like, oh, we can potentially do X, Y, and Z, and then C, and then we can discuss. But again, you need to have defined thresholds saying that this is material, I'm going to get, this is not going to go outside, versus this is use case, what in case a marketing campaign goes wrong, well, these are the potential repercussions. Is it an acceptable risk? Someone who just got a credit card, got another offer in the mail, asking this person to get another credit card from the same company or a similar product. So, well, those are the kinds of things you have to start discussing whether it's material enough to put in all the resources. So I know we are going to end in a few minutes. I just want to tell if anybody is interested in kind of learning this, there's a course coming up. We are partnered with Premier to make this operational. It's a 4-session course. We've been doing this for multiple companies and going into companies and doing these workshops. But we thought we'll kind of release it as a course. And there's also an optional capstone project. I'll just kind of briefly discuss this and then move on to Q&A. So I talked about the 4 pillars. So we basically converted those 4 pillars into 4 sessions. Session 1 is about the fundamentals, about like what are the foundations you need to know from a vernacular perspective. And then the second session is about some of the discussions which we're having with respect to agents and MCP tools. So we have labs associated with it. So I mean, just to give you an idea, in the Q-Create application, right? So we have basically labs for each one of them, and then so this is just basically an example of a lab. So we have like notebooks and specifications, and then each one of them comes with a lab, so that you can actually try out these use cases and understand how these are actually done in practice, and not we don't want to make you conversant of these issues but not able to act on it. We always end something with an actionable item so that you know how to handle particular situations. That way you can potentially extend that knowledge to other kinds of use cases. And the third session is all about evaluation and metrics on the various challenges and how you can think about an evaluation harness and red teaming. And the fourth session is about governance, because we don't have a prescription at this point. How do you create a framework on your own? What are the kinds of things you have to think about? And then the inventory and other aspects which needs to be factored in. And this is just a end-to-end use case. The goal is to take a suspicious activity report narration using LLMs, and then building out the transaction pipeline, the generation, the validation, the review, and the reporting. So you have one full use case on how you can potentially take an LLM product and do it. So it's all over Zoom. I mean, no pressure. If you don't feel like now is the right time, you don't have to join in. But I thought it may be of interest because many times we get reached out saying, are you doing anything on an extended basis, not just a webinar? So this is like 16 to 20 hours of commitment over a period of a month. So if you're interested, you can join it. So either the Premier site or I'll share the link in a second. It's qagentic.ai .base44.app. So you have information. And I'll also send out an email tomorrow with the slide deck. That way you can look at it. The class starts on June 23rd. And with our partnerships, we have some discounts for full-time members. And also, if you're a financial professional with a charter and you're kind of already in the system, we'd love to kind of have you take this course. That way you can extend your knowledge. So that's all I had. And I know there are a couple of questions people are asking, so I'm going to try and see if I can potentially answer any of questions. So Walter Wanga, is the session intended to be in person or virtual? So this is all virtual, so you can take it from anywhere in the world. So it's starting on June 23rd. There are going to be 4 3-hour Zoom sessions, and all the sessions will be recorded if it's not in conducive for your particular time zone, but it's all going to be live over Zoom in a very similar setting. And I know there are a couple of questions, so let me see if I can try and answer any questions. So yes, all the course information, the costs are all there on the website. And yeah, so I think Wayne had a comment. So Abhishek, you had a question about like, how do you find these parameters, wait for it? So that's the calibration piece. So because, you will basically have humans do the weighting, and then you're going to have the systems do the weighting, and then you do the calibration. So that's the calibration process you're going to go. Okay. Wayne, you had a question. LLM as judge seems to be like an extrapolation of the ground truth, possibly from a knowledge graph. In some ways, yes. But also, I think, when you think about LLM as a judge, I have to provide specific skills and kind of use prompt engineering to, first of all, create the persona I'm interested in. Because it's not just, think of yourselves as an expert quant building a particular model and then do this. That will not give you the results you're looking for. So you will have to think about something like, if I'm doing fairness analysis, saying, hey, I am a fairness analyst. I am based in the United States. Here are the laws and here are the regulations which are important for me. I am a subject matter expert in all these. If I need to, I can go in and reference these particular things. Oh, by the way, I also have this kind of experience, and these are the kind of frameworks. These are the kinds of metrics. I provide like a whole skill file, which basically has the persona, and then say, using this, do specific tasks. And that gives me richer information as I kind of build out my prompts. So that's thing. So Gopi, what's the difference between QSkillBridge and QCreate? Good question. So QSkillBridge is the way you access the course. QCreate is the way we create the course. We use a lot of LLM. We eat our own dog food. No shame in saying that. All the labs, there are Streamlit labs, there are Jupyter Notebooks. We have agents which we use to create end-to-end applications, and we vet it out, we test it out, and we can scale. In fact, if you go to QSkillBridge and try out some of the labs, most of the labs which you're seeing are created by AI and vetted out by humans. So we kind of have a whole process. The QCreate prompts I showed you. So every time there's actually a very specific prompt for a particular case study, and we basically tie it. So we are kind of practicing it on a regular basis to build out the material, and we are learning along the way because certain things work and certain times you may have to kind of build it up. Okay. So Carrie Miller, at some point will you cover agentic FinOps, billing for orchestration platforms, translate the invoices? It's a great question, Carrie. I don't know if there is a specific case study at this point. talking about this particular use case, but if you reach out to me, I'll see if there is anything in our database which could potentially help you. And many a times the capstone project is something which we can let you also explore, and we can provide you guidance on how to build something like that. Okay. And which models or agents should be added to the MRM model inventory? Is this risk-based, all of them, or customer-facing models? That's a great question. I mean, that's where the framework is required in the first place, because you don't have a prescriptive mechanism to say, all this will go into my inventory. There is obviously the tiering, but then you also have to think about like what parts of your mechanism needs to be treated as a model in the first place. What parts of the pipeline? So are you governing the entire pipeline? So maybe it's not the model itself, because as I said, if you're building out an agentic system, you're governing the actions. So it's not a model. So you're not actually thinking of it as a model itself. So you're building out a governance framework for the agentic actions, right? So yeah, so it's kind of a framework-based question rather than in some way treating it as let's bucket it into a particular model category. And then do you foresee MRM needing to be more involved during the development stage in contrast to prior predictive models? Absolutely. I would say this is the discussion of the day, because many a times it's not going to be sufficient for MRM folks to come at the end and say, okay, now you tell me how you built it, and now we're going to do the validation. I think the cycle is changing, wherein MRM is deeply integrating itself into the development process. In some ways, developers will be taking some of the MRM role, wherein they are kind of building the test harness, factoring in by design the audit requirements, and kind of building out the things along the way so that they're generating the artifacts for them to test it out. And those become the things which the validators can look at, right? So it's becoming a loaded question on how much of independence can we have between the first line and the second line. Another question, what information can we reasonably request from a vendor to support MRM review? That's again another question which has been in discussion for a while. We don't have a standard answer for that. It depends on what the vendor is using AI for. For example, if let's say we are thinking about a vendor who creates factors, and the factors are actually generated using AI. Now, you as a consumer of these factors will never interface with the AI pipelines at all. You will just be consuming the factors. And you may say, I want labeling so that these are AI generated factors. These are traditional statistical factors or historical factors, which I'm going to be using, and I don't want to use any of the AI factors. So you need to give me clear distinction or whether AI was used in the process of creating these factors, right? So that is one disclosure you may want to ask. The other kinds of things you may want to ask are, oh, I would like to see your AI pipeline and how you are generating the factors in the first place. And I don't know if all the vendors are going to be able to reveal it. That's where model cards and other things are there. And vendors typically will start with like something canned, saying this is what we already have, but we can give you a meeting with the developer team and answer any specific kinds of constraints. These are the kinds of typical cybersecurity reviews you have. Similarly, you may have like meetings with the development team to see whether you are comfortable with their development process, right? On the other hand, there may be backfilling processes. For example, if they are using time series data and they do not have enough information, they may be use AI to create those data sets. They could be using synthetic data to augment traditional data to train an LLM. So all those are things which you may not know till you actually ask the questions. So that is where I think you have to, first of all, holistically figure out like what are the companies selling you in the first place, or many of these companies are actually now adding an AI layer over it, just either because of convenience or because it's another feature they're augmenting with the traditional features. I know some companies are explicitly saying, turn off those AI features. I don't want them as a part of my design cycle. But again, that's something which is, again, evolving. There are no regulations which say you should be asking these. It's something you will have to come up with as a part of your terms and conditions with your vendors. Okay. So I think we are a little over time, but I know you still have a lot more questions. So as I said, if you go to Q Agentic AI, So this is qagentic.ai.base44.app. So I'm just going to throw that in the chat window if you are interested. And also an email will go out tomorrow, which will talk about all the various things which will be there in the course, and also the discount codes and other things. But that's where the thing. But one thing I forgot to mention. So if you go to the site, and there is a webinar link. And alongside, there is also view course details. So if you go to the view course details, it has like all the information about the course. So let me see if I can share my screen and share that for you. So if you go to the course website, there is information about the course and what you're going to be learning. But also, we just released the full white paper called Generative AI in Finance for Model Risk Professionals, and I'll throw a link for that in the chat window too. So feel free to also download it. There's a PDF document which you can download in the white paper. So wherein more or less all the things which we discussed in the slides today, I've kind of embedded those slides, and I've provided my thoughts on what it actually means. So it's a good read for you if you're interested in kind of understanding where we are coming from as a part of this discussion. And also, you're all connected online, I believe. So if there are any questions, feel free to join the chat or the discussion, or email me, and happy to continue the conversation. Thanks again for your time, and see you soon, either in the course or in one of our